How could a single voice message destroy everything I thought I controlled? I demanded my husband approve a friends with benefits arrangement with my ex or face divorce, believing he would cave like always. Instead, 3 days later, a courier arrived at my office lobby with documents that ended my marriage in front of 30 witnesses, and I had no one to blame but myself. I'm Kanaya, and I have never been the kind of woman who settles for mediocrity or boredom. Which is why when Dane Holloway sent me that message 6 months ago, I felt something I had not felt in years. Alive, desired, and free from the suffocating predictability of my marriage to Thomas. It was a Tuesday evening in late April when everything started to shift beneath the surface of my carefully constructed life, and I was standing in the gym locker room after a particularly intense workout, my phone buzzing with a notification that made my heart race in a way that Thomas had not managed to do in at least 3 years. The message was from Dane, my college ex, the man who used to make me laugh until I cried and who never once asked me to compromise or dim my light for the sake of comfort or stability. "Tonight was amazing," the message read, followed by a second line that made me smile despite the sweat still cooling on my skin. "When can we do it again?" I felt a thrill run through me, the kind of electric excitement that comes from knowing you are wanted, truly wanted, not just tolerated or provided for like some kind of obligation that needs to be checked off a list every month when the bills come due. I was still staring at the screen, my thumb hovering over the reply box, when I heard the familiar sound of Thomas's footsteps echoing across the tile floor of the locker area, and I immediately locked my phone and slipped it into my gym bag, forcing a casual smile onto my face as he rounded the corner and waved at me with that gentle, unassuming expression he always wore, the one that used to make me feel safe but now just made me feel trapped. He asked me if I had a good session, his voice warm and genuinely curious, and I told him I did, though my tone came out sharper than I intended, clipped and defensive in a way that made him pause for just a second before he nodded and turned toward his locker, clearly deciding not to push the issue because that was Thomas. Always giving me space, always accommodating, always so frustratingly understanding that I sometimes wanted to scream just to get a reaction out of him. Later that night, around 11:30, I found myself curled up in the armchair in our living room, my phone glowing softly in my lap as I texted Dane back and forth, making plans for another meetup and laughing at inside jokes that Thomas would never understand because he had never been spontaneous or adventurous the way Dane was, and I could feel Thomas's eyes on me from the sofa where he sat with his laptop open, reviewing work emails or organising one of his endless spreadsheets. He asked me who I was talking to so late, and I could hear the careful neutrality in his voice, the way he was trying not to sound accusatory or controlling. And I told him it was Jessa, my best friend, planning a girls' trip we had been discussing for weeks, which was not entirely a lie because Jessa and I had talked about a trip once, though I had no real intention of going anywhere with her when I could be spending that time with Dane instead. Thomas nodded and said nothing else, but the silence that settled between us felt heavy and thick, and I hated the way he made me feel guilty without even saying a word, as if his quiet disappointment was somehow more powerful than any accusation he could have thrown at me. Around midnight, I went upstairs to get ready for bed, and I left my phone face down on the nightstand, but I could see the glow beneath it pulsing with incoming messages, and when Thomas came in a few minutes later after brushing his teeth, I saw him glance at the phone without touching it, his jaw tightening just slightly before he turned away and climbed into bed on his side, leaving a cold expanse of sheets between us that felt wider than any physical distance. I could not sleep, so I grabbed the phone and went back downstairs, and when I walked into the living room, I found Thomas still awake, his laptop open on the coffee table, a spreadsheet labelled Household, displayed on the screen with neat columns of dates and expenses that made me roll my eyes because of course he was organising bills at 1 in the morning instead of doing something interesting or spontaneous. I asked him why he was not in bed, and he said he was just organising things, but I noticed a browser tab in the background before he closed it quickly, and though I could not read the full title, I caught the words "Lawyer Consultation Free" which made something twist uneasily in my stomach, though I pushed the feeling away and told myself he was probably just researching something for work or helping a friend. When I sat down across from him with a glass of water, I could not hold back anymore, and I accused him of checking up on me, of being jealous and insecure, and I listed every recent example I could think of: how he asked about my workout partner, my evening plans, my phone habits, and I told him he was being needy and that I needed my own life, my own space, my own identity outside of this marriage that had started to feel like a cage. Thomas listened quietly, his face unreadable, and when I finished, he agreed softly, closed his laptop, and went upstairs without another word, leaving me alone on the sofa with my phone glowing in my lap and a strange, hollow feeling spreading through my chest that I refused to acknowledge as guilt. The next afternoon, I met Dane at a trendy co-working space cafe near my office, the kind of place with exposed brick walls and baristas who took themselves far too seriously, and I felt a rush of excitement as I walked through the glass doors and saw him sitting at a corner table, his leather jacket draped over the back of his chair and a confident smile spreading across his face when he noticed me approaching. He ordered an espresso and I asked for a latte, and we spent the next hour talking about everything and nothing, laughing about old college stories and inside jokes that made me feel 22 again instead of 33, and married and weighed down by the expectations of a life I had not chosen so much as fallen into because it seemed like the right thing to do at the time. I did not notice the woman sitting at the table next to ours, a brunette in a grey blazer who glanced over at us twice with an expression that was equal parts curious and disapproving. And I certainly did not recognise her as someone from Thomas's company, someone who would later mention the sighting in passing to a co-worker who would then bring it up to Thomas in a way that seemed innocent but carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken questions. Dane reached across the table at one point and touched my hand, his fingers warm and deliberate, and I did not pull away even though I knew I should have, even though some small voice in the back of my mind whispered that this was crossing a line I could not uncross, but I ignored that voice because it sounded too much like Thomas's quiet disappointment, and I was so tired of feeling guilty for wanting something more than the safe, predictable life I had been living for the past 6 years. When I returned to my open plan office around 2:30 that afternoon, my assistant mentioned that Thomas had called while I was out, and I felt a flicker of irritation because of course he had called. Of course he could not just let me have lunch without checking in like I was some kind of teenager who needed supervision. I ignored the missed call and opened Instagram on my phone, scrolling through my feed with one eye on my computer screen, and I saw that Dane had posted a photo of his espresso cup with the caption, "Good company makes good coffee." And without thinking, I liked the post immediately, my thumb hitting the heart icon before my brain caught up with what I was doing. 3 seconds later, I panicked and unliked it, hoping no one had noticed, but the damage was already done because notifications do not disappear just because you change your mind. And somewhere in the digital ether, that tiny action was recorded and time-stamped and impossible to take back. The next day, Wednesday, I was in the office break room around 3:15, pouring myself a cup of coffee that had been sitting on the burner too long and tasted burnt and bitter when Liam Torres walked in, one of Thomas's co-workers from the IT department. A quiet guy with wire-rimmed glasses who always seemed to be observing more than he let on. He poured himself a cup and made small talk about the weather, and then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned that he thought he had seen me the day before at the cafe on 5th Street, and I felt my entire body stiffen even though I forced my face to stay relaxed and casual. I told him I had been meeting a vendor to discuss some marketing materials, and he nodded slowly and said the guy I was with looked familiar, maybe from college or something, and I laughed it off and changed the subject to an upcoming project deadline, steering the conversation away from dangerous territory while my heart hammered against my ribs and I cursed myself for being so careless, for meeting Dane somewhere so public where anyone could see us. That evening, when I got home around 8 o'clock, Thomas asked me how my day had been, and I told him it was boring, just back-to-back meetings and paperwork, nothing worth talking about. He asked if I had gone out for lunch, and I paused for just a fraction of a second before telling him I had grabbed a salad at my desk, and I watched his jaw tighten in that way it did when he knew I was lying but did not want to call me out directly, did not want to start a fight, or be accused of being controlling or paranoid. He picked up his phone and opened some kind of note app, typing something short and quick before locking the screen and setting it face down on the coffee table, and I wondered what he was writing, but I did not ask because I did not really want to know, did not want to face the possibility that he was building some kind of case against me, documenting every inconsistency and contradiction in preparation for something I could not yet see coming. Later that night, around 10:30, I took a long shower, and when I came back into the bedroom with my hair wrapped in a towel, I saw that my phone was still sitting on the dresser where I had left it, and there were 3 new Instagram notifications glowing on the lock screen. Thomas was already in bed, lying on his side facing away from me, and I asked if he was mad about something, and he said he was just tired, but his voice was flat and emotionless, in a way that felt worse than anger, felt like he was already somewhere else emotionally, already building walls between us that I could not see but could definitely feel pressing against my chest every time I tried to breathe. The next morning, Thursday, I came downstairs around 7 and found Thomas in the kitchen pouring coffee into 2 mugs, but instead of setting them on the counter next to each other the way he usually did, he placed them on opposite sides, one near the sink and one near the stove. And that small gesture felt loaded with meaning, felt like he was physically illustrating the distance that had grown between us. I took my mug without comment and checked my phone, scrolling through messages and emails, and when I glanced up, I saw Thomas checking his phone as well, looking at a calendar entry that read Westbrook 9:45 a.m., with no other context or explanation. And before I could ask what it meant, he closed the app and slipped the phone into his pocket, his face giving away absolutely nothing as he picked up his laptop bag and walked out the door without saying goodbye. Friday night arrived with the promise of freedom and excitement, and I met Dane at a rooftop bar downtown, the kind of place with string lights and a view of the city skyline that made everything feel cinematic and important. And Jessa was there along with 3 other friends from my marketing circle, people who appreciated spontaneity and living in the moment rather than obsessing over spreadsheets and retirement plans the way Thomas did. Dane was telling a story about a road trip he and I had taken during our junior year of college, something involving a broken-down car in the middle of nowhere and a sketchy motel where we had to share a bathroom with strangers, and I found myself adding details and laughing in a way that felt genuine and unguarded, the way I used to laugh before I became the wife of a man who treated life like a series of problems that needed to be solved with logic and planning. Someone at the table, I think it was Rebecca from the design team, asked why Thomas was not there with us, and I felt a flash of irritation at the question because I had not even considered inviting him, had not wanted to bring his quiet disapproval and careful observation into a space that was supposed to be mine. And I said something dismissive about him probably being at home, organizing spreadsheets or filing receipts. And the group laughed in that uncomfortable way people do when they are not sure if a joke is mean-spirited or just honest. Dane raised his glass and said something about toasting to spontaneity and living without fear, and I clinked my glass against his a little too hard, a little too long, and I saw Jessa watching us from across the table with an expression I could not quite read, something between concern and judgment that made me defensive before she had even said a word. Around 10:15, Jessa pulled me aside near the railing where we could see the city lights spreading out below us like a carpet of possibilities, and she asked if everything was okay at home. Her voice low and careful, and I told her Thomas was fine, just boring, just exactly the same as he had always been, predictable and stable and completely incapable of making me feel the way Dane did with just a smile or a touch. Jessa frowned and said that was harsh, that Thomas was a good man who loved me, and I shrugged and said I had married too young, that I had settled for security when I should have been looking for passion and excitement, that I deserved more than a life where the most thrilling thing that happened all week was balancing the checkbook on a Sunday morning. Jessa did not respond, just looked at me with something that felt like disappointment. And when I glanced back at the table, I saw Dane watching us with an intensity that made my skin feel warm, despite the cool evening breeze. The next night, Saturday, was my mother Claudia's birthday dinner at a family restaurant. One of those places with long tables and too much noise and waiters who sang off-key when they brought out the cake, and Thomas sat beside me looking tired and withdrawn, his shoulders slightly hunched as if he was trying to make himself smaller, less noticeable. His sister Raina was sitting directly across from us, and I could feel her eyes on me throughout the meal, watching the way I checked my phone under the table every few minutes, the way I barely spoke to Thomas except to ask him to pass the bread or refill my water glass. My phone buzzed around 7:45, and I glanced at the screen just long enough to see a notification banner that said, Dane, and I locked it quickly, but not before Thomas's eyes flicked toward the screen for just a fraction of a second, his jaw tightening in that now familiar way that told me he had seen it too. When dessert arrived and my mother stood to thank everyone for coming, I felt a sudden impulse to say something, to make some kind of statement about who I was and what I wanted from life. And before I could second-guess myself, I stood up with my wine glass and offered a toast that started innocently enough, talking about adventure and living fully and not being afraid to chase the things that made you feel alive. Then I looked directly at Thomas and said that some of us settle for safe and predictable, but I believed life should be more exciting than planning for retirement at 30, and there was a beat of silence before a few people chuckled nervously, unsure whether I was joking or serious, and I saw Raina's smile vanish completely, replaced by something cold and angry that made me realize I had crossed a line I had not even known existed. Thomas sipped his water and said nothing, did not defend himself or argue or even look hurt, just sat there with that calm, unreadable expression that made me feel like I was screaming into a void. And when the dinner finally ended around 9 o'clock, Raina followed Thomas out to the parking lot while I stayed behind to say goodbye to my mother. I watched through the restaurant window as Raina touched Thomas's arm and spoke to him with obvious concern, and he shrugged and said something short before getting into his car. And the way Raina stood there watching him drive away made me feel uneasy in a way I could not quite articulate, as if she was seeing something I was deliberately ignoring, some truth I was not ready to face. When Thomas and I got home around 11 that night, I was humming some song I had heard at the bar the night before, feeling lighter and freer than I had in months, and I did not even notice that Thomas went straight to the guest room instead of following me upstairs until I turned around and saw him standing in the doorway with a pillow under one arm and his phone charger in his hand. I followed him and asked why he was being so dramatic, why he could not just accept that I needed space and freedom and a life that was not built entirely around his need for stability and control. And he looked at me with eyes that seemed older and sadder than they had been just a few weeks ago. And he said he was not being dramatic. He just wanted space too. And then he closed the guest room door in my face without raising his voice or slamming anything. Just a quiet, deliberate click that felt louder than any argument we had ever had. That night, lying alone in our bedroom for the first time in 6 years, I found myself unable to sleep, my mind racing with justifications and rationalizations for everything I had said and done. And around 11:30, I grabbed my phone and opened the voice message app, pressing record and speaking quietly into the microphone, telling Dane that I could not wait to see him on Monday, that Thomas was playing the victim again and making everything about his feelings instead of understanding what I needed from life. I said I was tired of pretending our marriage mattered, tired of walking on eggshells around someone who refused to give me the freedom and excitement I deserved, and I laughed a little as I said that if Thomas did not agree to let me see Dane, openly and honestly, without all this guilt and drama, then I would just divorce him and be done with it, because I was not going to waste the rest of my life being trapped in a relationship that made me feel dead inside. I hit send and watched the voice note whoosh away into the digital void, and I felt a strange mix of relief and defiance, as if speaking those words out loud made them more real, more justified, more like a reasonable stance rather than the selfish cruelty that some small part of me knew it actually was. I fell asleep around 1 in the morning, and when I woke up on Sunday around 8, I could hear voices downstairs, and I realized with a jolt of annoyance that Raina had arrived for the brunch we had planned weeks ago, back when things between Thomas and me had been tense but not yet completely fractured. I showered quickly and came downstairs with my hair still damp, and I found Raina in the kitchen with Thomas, the two of them speaking in low voices that stopped abruptly when I entered the room, and I forced a bright smile and greeted Raina cheerfully, asking about her week and her students and all the polite small talk that fills the space when everyone is pretending everything is fine. My phone was sitting on the kitchen counter where I had left it the night before, and as I reached for it, a notification appeared on the screen. "Dane liked your voice note," and I grabbed the phone quickly and shoved it into my pocket, hoping neither Thomas nor Raina had seen it. But when I glanced up, I caught Raina's eyes flicking away from where my phone had been, and I felt a cold prickle of unease crawl up my spine. Around 9:15, I went upstairs to change into something more presentable, and when I came back down, I saw that my phone was no longer in my pocket, but sitting on the arm of the living room sofa where I must have set it down without thinking, and Raina was in the room clearing plates from the coffee table, moving around the space with the casual efficiency of someone who had been in this house dozens of times before. My phone buzzed with another notification, and I saw Raina hesitate for just a second before glancing at the screen, and even from across the room I could see the preview of the voice note I had sent to Dane displayed on the lock screen, the words, "If Thomas doesn't agree, I'll just leave. He's boring anyway," visible in that truncated, damning format that made everything sound even worse than it already was. I watched Rena's face change, watched her eyes widen and then narrow, and she looked up and met my gaze for just a moment before I heard Thomas's footsteps descending the stairs behind me, and Raina carefully set down the plates and stepped back from the phone as if it was something dangerous, something she did not want to be caught touching. I grabbed the phone and shoved it into my jeans pocket, and the rest of brunch passed in a strained, uncomfortable silence, with Raina barely speaking to me and Thomas looking more exhausted than I had ever seen him. His eyes shadowed and distant, as if he was already somewhere else, already planning something I could not yet see. Around 2 o'clock that afternoon, Raina asked if I would take a walk with her, and something about the deliberate calm in her voice made me want to refuse. But I could not think of a good excuse, so I agreed, and we walked together along the park path near our house, the spring sunshine feeling too bright and cheerful for the tension that crackled between us, like static electricity. Raina asked if I was happy, and I said yes without hesitation. And then she asked about Thomas, and I said he was fine, just going through a phase or something, and then she took a deep breath and said, she had seen the voice note preview on my phone, and I felt my entire body go rigid with defensive anger. I told her she had misunderstood, that she was taking things out of context, that the message was not as bad as it sounded when you only saw a few words on a screen. But Raina cut me off and said she had heard enough, that she did not need more context to understand that I was actively planning to leave her brother while simultaneously humiliating him and making him feel worthless. And I felt a surge of rage at her self-righteousness, at her assumption that she understood my marriage better than I did. I accused her of snooping, of invading my privacy, of being jealous of the freedom and excitement I had in my life while she was stuck teaching high school students and going home to an empty apartment every night. And the moment the words left my mouth, I knew I had gone too far, knew I had said something unforgivable, but instead of apologizing, I just stood there watching as Raina turned and walked away without another word, her shoulders stiff with anger and disappointment. That evening around 6 o'clock, I was sitting on the living room sofa pretending to watch television when I heard Thomas's phone ring in the guest room, and through the closed door I could hear his voice, quiet and controlled, saying, "I already know and I'm handling it and thank you," in that measured tone that made me realize he and Raina were talking about me, were probably discussing that stupid voice note and making plans and turning my own family against me. When he emerged from the guest room 20 minutes later, his face was calm, but his eyes were harder than I had ever seen them. And when I demanded to know what Raina had said to him, he told me it was between them. And I saw his phone light up on the kitchen counter with a text from Raina that said, "I believe you. I'm here." And I felt something cold and terrible settle in my chest. The realization that I was losing control of the narrative, losing the ability to make everyone see things from my perspective. Segment 5. The ultimatum and the calm before. Monday evening arrived with the weight of an inevitable confrontation that I had been building toward for weeks. And at 7 o'clock, I sat down across from Thomas at the kitchen table, the same table where we had eaten countless dinners and paid bills and planned vacations back when things between us still felt like a partnership rather than a prison. I told him we needed to talk, and he nodded and set down his phone, giving me his full attention in that patient, infuriating way he had. And I launched into the speech I had been rehearsing in my head all day, explaining that I had been thinking about our marriage and that I still loved him but needed more than what he was able to give me, needed passion and excitement and the feeling of being truly desired rather than just tolerated as a permanent fixture in his carefully organized life. I told him that Dane made me feel alive in ways he had not managed to do in years, and I could see Thomas's jaw tighten at the mention of Dane's name, but he did not interrupt, did not argue, just sat there listening with that maddening calm that made me want to shake him until he showed some kind of emotion, some kind of reaction that proved he actually cared. I proposed what I thought was a reasonable compromise, a modern arrangement where I could see Dane openly and honestly while Thomas and I remained married, where everyone knew the truth and no one had to hide or lie. And I called it mature and progressive, and the kind of thing that couples who truly trusted each other could handle without all the jealousy and possessiveness that society told us we were supposed to feel. When I finished my speech, there was a long moment of silence. And then Thomas said one word, "No," and the simplicity of it, the quiet finality in his voice, made me blink in confusion because I had expected him to argue or negotiate, or at least ask questions, but instead he just repeated it, calmly and clearly, "No." I asked him why he was being so unreasonable, why he could not understand that this was about my needs and my happiness. And he looked at me with eyes that seemed to see right through all my justifications and rationalizations. And he said, because he deserved better than this. Deserved better than being asked to accept humiliation and betrayal, as if it was some kind of gift I was offering him. I felt anger flare hot in my chest, and I told him he was being dramatic and rigid and exactly as boring as I had always suspected he was beneath the surface, and he stood up slowly, pushing his chair back with a scrape that seemed too loud in the quiet kitchen. And he said he would handle this properly. And when I demanded to know what that meant, what he thought he was going to do, he just looked at me with something that might have been pity and walked to the guest room, closing the door with that same quiet click that had become the soundtrack of our dying marriage. Around 9 that night, I texted Jessa in a fury, typing out a long message about how Thomas was being impossible, how I had offered him a compromise that would have allowed everyone to be happy. And I waited for her response, expecting solidarity and support. But when her reply came 10 minutes later, it was short and cold. What kind of compromise? And when I explained the arrangement I had proposed, there was a long silence before she wrote back, "That's not a compromise. That's cruelty." And I stared at the screen, feeling like the ground was shifting beneath my feet, feeling like even my closest friend was turning against me for reasons I could not understand. Tuesday morning, I woke early and went to the kitchen for coffee. And through the window I saw Thomas loading a small cardboard box into the trunk of his car. And inside the box I could see a folder labelled Household, a USB stick, and a spiral notebook. And I felt a spike of panic that I immediately tried to rationalize away as paranoia. I texted him asking what he was doing, but he did not reply. And when I rushed out to the garage, he was already backing out of the driveway, his face expressionless behind the windshield. and I was left standing there in my pajamas feeling powerless and confused in a way I had not felt since this whole situation began. At work that day, I could not focus, could not stop checking my phone for messages from Thomas or Dane or anyone who might give me some sense of what was happening. And when I asked my assistant if Thomas had called, she said no, with a sympathetic look that made me want to scream. Around 10 o'clock, I checked Thomas's shared calendar on my laptop, something I rarely did anymore, and I saw an entry that simply said, "Consultation, 10 a.m., with no location or additional details." And I felt my stomach twist with anxiety because I knew, somehow I knew, that he was meeting with someone about us, about me, about ending this marriage in a way that would not give me any control over the outcome. Wednesday afternoon, Thomas had another appointment, this time in the HR meeting room at his office building, and I only knew about it because Liam had mentioned it in passing to someone in my department, saying Thomas had been in a closed-door meeting for over 30 minutes, and when Thomas finally emerged, Liam said he looked different, calmer somehow, more resolved. And that night, when I tried to ask Thomas what he had been doing, where he had been going, who he had been meeting with, he told me it was personal and none of my business, and his tone was so flat and final that I found myself unable to push back the way I normally would have. Thursday morning, I confronted him in the kitchen before he could leave for work, demanding to know what he was planning, what he thought he was going to accomplish by playing these childish games of silence and secrecy. And he set down his coffee mug and looked at me with eyes that held no warmth, no affection, no trace of the man who had once promised to love me for better or worse. He said he had one final meeting scheduled for Thursday morning, and after that, everything would be clear. And when I demanded details, demanded to know what he meant by that cryptic statement, he said only that I would understand tomorrow. And then he picked up his laptop bag and walked out the door, leaving me standing alone in the kitchen with a fear growing in my chest that I could no longer ignore or explain away. A fear that whispered I had pushed too far, demanded too much, and that the consequences I had never believed would come were finally, inevitably, on their way. I sat at my desk staring at the papers for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. And when I finally looked up, I saw my co-workers watching me through the glass partition walls, their expressions ranging from curiosity to pity to barely concealed satisfaction at seeing someone who had always seemed so confident now completely broken. My phone buzzed one more time and I looked down to see a calendar notification Thomas must have shared weeks ago, something I had ignored until now. Final meeting complete, moving forward. And below that, in smaller text, a note that simply read, "Consultation complete, paperwork filed, next step June 30th. And I realized he had been planning this for weeks, maybe longer, while I had been so focused on Dane and my own desires that I had completely missed the signs of a man who had reached his limit and decided to take back control of his life in the only way the law allowed.